I'm going to show you the two scopes we're going to use to do color correction work inside Premiere Pro. Now I know that some people's eyes glaze over when I talk about scopes, but don't let that happen to you because I think you're going to see how practical these guys are and how easy they are to use and how much better they're going to make your projects look. So let's go over to Working Files, open up Projects, and scroll on down here to 1103 Scopes. Now what we have here is the standard color correction workspace. Now yours might look a little bit different than mine, but what I want to make sure you have is that you've got the reference monitor here front and center. Now you might not see the scopes like this, but I'm going to get you to go there in a second. You also might notice that I've got two sequences here, one that I'm calling color workspace sequence and one that's called the PAL sequence, because some folks may work in PAL, and things are just a little bit different if you're working with the PAL standard, so I'll show you that in a moment. So let's go take a look at some scopes. If you don't have this view, go over here to this panel menu and go down to All Scopes. These are the four scopes that come with Premiere Pro. We are going to work with only these two. This is called the YC waveform. This is the vector scope. These other guys are called parades. This is the RGB parade and the YCBCR parade. So YCBCR also refers to YUV, which is the original video format for video coming off of typical video files that are then converted to RGB, red, green, and blue, so you can see them inside a computer monitor. But there are no effects in Premiere Pro that deal with YCBCR or YUV directly. So this is more for academic interest rather than practical color correction use for our purposes. RGB Parade is kind of practical, but not for our purposes for what we're going to do. RGB Parade represents the three individual color channels, red, green, and blue, and basically the intensity or luminance of each of those channels, but it's not true luminance. It's kind of a combination of chroma, that's hue, and luminance. So in some ways it's sort of impractical to use this, but it can come in handy, especially when you're using effects that are specifically geared to red, green, and blue channels. But we're going to focus on these two guys. Let's look at them individually by starting with this one, the YC waveform. So click on this drop-down list and go to YC waveform. It looks like that. And right off the bat, I want you to change some things. YC stands for luminance, chrominance. Y is luminance, C is chrominance. Luminance sometimes is called brightness and contrast or tonality. Chrominance is sometimes called chroma or hue, but at any rate, it's talking about your tonality and your color. We're not interested in chroma here. We're interested only in brightness and luminance. So I'm going to turn off chroma. We don't need to see this blue stuff. We need to see only the green graph here. And we don't need this setup 7.5 IRE thing anymore either. This is kind of old school broadcast safe issues. And those things really don't apply anymore in the HD world. So just uncheck that. The intensity refers to how bright the scope is, not how bright things are that you're viewing in it. So the intensity is something you just set for your own purposes. If you want to make it brighter or darker, that's up to you. I'm going to leave it at the default 50%. So what do we see here? We're seeing brightness. We're seeing luminance for the clip that's above us here. And as you go through the clip, you'll see that the scope changes. That's because it's dynamic. It'll adjust depending on what's up here inside the clip. What it's showing you here is brightness inside this clip or luminance in the clip. Down here is the dark area. And so you see a lot of dark area here all along the bottom. But the fact that it's on the bottom here doesn't mean that it's on the bottom here. This just happens to be where the dark area is. This line here along the top is the brightest area in the clip and happens to coincide with this little area right there. Notice the left-hand side's got this little shrub on it here, so you don't see any bright area there. So it's left to right is how it's representing things here. So this little line here shows that there's some brightness here. Right here it's kind of empty because there aren't too many midtones here. Either it's kind of bright or it's kind of dark without too many sort of gray things in the middle. You can also spot a couple of other things here. If you look to the right, you see that's the brightest spot there. That corresponds to that sort of bright area there. Kind of peaks to the brightness there. That's this little bright area right there, a little bit brighter than the left and the right. The dark areas you can see are down here. This dark area right there refers to the dark area that you're seeing down here. And the dark area on the right, see how it kind of dips down to the right because you see this darker area getting bigger here on the right. So there's more area that's dark. So this is really a good way to see things from left to right. And it's really a good way to judge whether you've got the right dynamic range of luminance in your clips. Your dynamic range should go from 0 to 100. You don't want to have anything darker than 0. You want to bring your darkest areas, your shadows, down to the 0 line. This is 0 IRE. IRE stands for Institute of Radio Engineers. How radio engineers got involved in video, who knows, but that's what it's called. Anyways, you want to bring your shadows down to 0. Now, sometimes you have some clips where the shadows actually go below 0, so you need to bring them up to 0. That's your goal. to have them just touch that 0 line there. It's not really a crime if you bring them slightly below there, but you'll have more areas that are just black. Anything in the 0 line just has no details, so you do want to have some detail throughout your clip, except for just a couple little areas of the black and a couple areas of white that have no detail. This area at the top here are called your highlights, and you want to bring your highlights up to 100. But a lot of high definition video these days actually shoots in super whites between 100 and 110, and you can bring those guys down and they will have detail in them. The high definition camcorders record detail in the super white areas. So when you bring it down to 100, you're going to start seeing detail in those areas. So your goal, again, is to kind of make sure you have a full dynamic range from 0, very, very dark shadows, to 100, very bright highlights, and then a nice flow of midtones throughout. That's kind of your goal there. You take the same basic approach if you're working in a PAL sequence, that is the phase alternating line standard common in Europe. I'm just going to switch over to a PAL sequence with the same clip in it. I had to change the aspect ratio a bit to make it fit in there, so the scope will look a little different when we go from one to the next. But at any rate, you can see how the scopes are similar. Only difference is these numbers along the side here. This is volts rather than the IRE that you see over here on the NTSC side of things. But back in PAL, you just go from 0.3 to 1.0. That's the same range as 0 to 100 here over on the IRE side. So again, here's PAL. You want to have the darkest areas in your clip just touch the 0.3 line, and you want the brightest areas to touch the 1.0 line here to have proper dynamic range for your clips. And that's really the only place you need to worry about the difference between PAL and NTSC. Other places like color, you work in the same scopes. So let's go back to the NTSC sequence. That's tonality. This is the guy you use to fix tonality, and it's pretty straightforward. You're going to see how easy it is once we work on it in the next lesson. The next scope I want you to look at is the vector scope. Go over here, go to the vector scope. The vector scope shows hue, shows color, and all this stuff here may be a little bit confusing, but let's just take a look at the color wheel. I'm going to make this clip active. I'm going to go to Fast Color Corrector and double click on it. That'll add it to this clip. We'll open up Effect Controls. There it is. And look at the color wheel, and then look at the vector scope. Right there that says R. That stands for red. Red over here. Over here is B for blue. There's blue. Over here is green, G for green, like that. So we have red, green, and blue, matching the color wheel. Red, green, and blue. And the complementary colors, right across from blue here, yellow. Right across from blue, that's yellow. Right across from green, the complementary color is magenta. There's magenta right there. And right across from red, the complementary color is cyan, right down there, cyan. So this represents this color wheel. So if I start pulling the color wheel in a direction, you're going to watch the scope change. I'm going to pull the color wheel in the direction of red. And it's going to give a red color cast to the clip. Watch the clip turn red. And watch that vector scope show that I have now pulled things to red. The vector scope is indicating, whoa, you've got a lot of red here, my friend. If I bring it back down to the middle here like that, the middle part is neutral. Everything around there means that you're approaching neutral. You're approaching gray. If I were to drop the saturation on this clip to 0, right now the saturation is 100, which is default, which is normal. If I start dropping the saturation out, which means removing color essentially, watch what happens to the center of this guy. It's going to shrink. It's going to go down toward the center till it becomes gray. So gray is the center of the scope, means there's no color, no hue there. Pull it out, there's saturation. I can increase the saturation, and we expand the saturation like that. Now these little boxes here are supposed to indicate how far you can pull saturation. If you look up here, it says 75%. So 75% is kind of the golden rule for a number that you're not supposed to exceed in the old days. But now in HD, that no longer applies. You can try to really fully saturate your clips. So change the view here to 100%, and that shows the real saturation. You don't need to worry about having it stop at 75. These little boxes on the outside are about as far as you're supposed to go if you want to remain in what's called broadcast safe. But again, broadcast safe doesn't really apply that much anymore. So let me show you what you can do. I've taken this saturation to 200. I'm going to duplicate this fast color corrector. I'm going to go right click and say copy, right click again and say paste. And when I say paste, watch what happens to the vector scope. It's going to double the saturation. Bam, it just spread it out. Notice what happened up to the vector scope and what happened to the clip. It gets really pretty heavily saturated. It's right on the border of being too saturated. I'm going to do that again, right click and go paste again, and wham. Now we've gone beyond all logic in terms of saturation, but you can see what happens when you saturate a lot and see how the scope responds to that saturation. I'm going to take one of those guys now and drop the saturation back down to something semi-reasonable. Here we go, and open up this little guy and slide it over a bit like that. You can see we're pulling the saturation back in now to something that would be at least more reasonable, although I'm not sure those colors are what I'd like to see in this particular clip, but that's saturation, folks. Now that I've shown you the saturation, I can also show you how the color wheel works and how that relates to the vector scope. Right now we've got this overall color cast that's not going any particular direction. It's going a little bit toward red, a little bit toward blue, but it's not going toward any one color. If I can pull it toward one color as I did before like that, I can bring it around, watch how it goes around, and watch the image up on the top there as I go around. Going over to blue now, you can see that the scope is trending toward blue. I go down to green, it'll trend toward green. I can take this controller here, which moves things in large chunks like that, and really pull it toward green, such that it'll just all be green and all the detail goes away. Pull that back again. Just move this guy around like so. That's how the fast color corrector works in terms of pulling color in a particular direction. You can also move the hue like this, shift it around like that. Notice how the vector scope is corresponding to the movement of this wheel. So if you want to shift the hue a little bit, lots of times I aim for what's called flesh tone colors, and flesh tone colors line up right on that line right there. It's really a cool way to get your color correct. If you've got a face in the picture, you can use a flesh tone to get the color exactly right. So if the color is like this when I'm checking the flesh tone, I just rotate the wheel a little bit to bring it in line. That's how this guy works. I think it's really cool that the vector scope corresponds so directly to the fast color corrector. So I hope you see that working with these vector scopes is not all that complicated. They're really practical. And even if our eyes are telling us that, well, the clip is too bright or it's too dark, if you look at the waveform, you're going, well, no, the waveform says it's just right. So I'm not going to let my eyes be the judge here. I'm going to let the waveform be the judge. Or you look at the vector scope and you're thinking, boy, this clip looks kind of orange, but the vector scope is telling you that it's absolutely neutral, everything is fine. Then you trust the vector scope. So that wraps up these two scopes. In the next lesson, we're going to start doing some tonality correction.